thanking our ancestors, acknowledging the spirits of this place where I live and work, Yanawana, San Antonio, Texas. I also acknowledge and thank Jessica and the staff at AFS, our host for this webinar, and of course, Mary, Robert, Carl, and Amy for spearheading today's webinar, Heritage, Folklore, and the Public Sphere. Thank you to the Public Program section and the AFS Fellows for this initiative. It fits so well within the Society's goals. In some ways, today's event answers the call by our membership as expressed in a survey from a few years back and in various comments and observation at our last annual meeting last October for holding such conversations, not just for our members and our field, but for beyond that. The Cultural Diversity Committee and many sections of AFS have been indefatigably working to achieve conversations across disciplines, across apparent divides that include ethnic, national, gender, and all the other intersections that might divide us. I personally thank those who are looking to the future and are working to make AFS all it can be in the world and at home. Thank you who are joining us on the other side of this screen for joining us. All of you who are doing what Ansaldúa called work that matters, the important work of folklore, of heritage in the public sphere. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. And I now turn it over to Amy Schumann, the current president of the Fellows of the American Folklore Society.
Thank you all for coming. We're thrilled there's so many people here. Today's webinar builds on the success of the Fellows-sponsored Utley Lecture at the last AFS meeting. Although the AFS Fellows Executive Committee, Mary Hufford, Robert Barron, and I have coordinated this webinar, this and future webinars are not limited to Fellows, and we want to thank especially the Public Programs section of AFS for co-sponsorship of this webinar. So many of us are experiencing isolation with the pandemic. We thought it would be worthwhile to engage ideas, create forums, and have intellectual exchange throughout the year rather than just at AFS. This particular webinar evolved from discussions with Robert Barron and Carl Lindahl, who are both planning sessions at the upcoming AFS related to our theme today of heritage, folklore, and the public sphere. We're planning a second webinar, a follow-up to the AFS Utley lecture on race on June 2nd. Jose Limon and Norma Cantu are putting together that program. And we'll have more information about that webinar, how to register both on the AFS website and in various listservs. Today we have 6 panelists representing different dimensions of heritage research. We'll hear from each of them and then we'll moderate a dialogue among them. Following that discussion, we'll have some time to address your questions. You can post questions or comments at any point in the chat. We realize that with so many of you, it'll be impossible to engage all of your questions. So we've created a follow-up event, small group salons, we're calling them, on particular topics discussed today that will be facilitated by heritage scholars. That'll be on Friday, April 9th at 11 a.m. and at 2 p.m. We'll post information about how to sign up for the salons at the end of this webinar, and you'll also be able to find the sign-up information on the AFS website. The salons will be organized by topic, so please also suggest topics of interest to you on the chat. We'll leave the chat open for about a half an hour after the webinar so that you have time to post additional comments or questions or ideas for the salons. So everyone who's registered today is muted. Closed captioning is available. You can find it at the bottom of your screen. And we are recording this session. The recording will be posted to the AFS website, so it will be available to people who are unable to attend today and who want to still attend the small group salons. So I'm going to introduce our 3 moderators. First, Carl Lindahl, who is the Martha Gano Hofstein Research Professor at the University of Houston. He specializes in folktale, legends, and festive traditions in the English-speaking, French-speaking, and medieval worlds. disaster narratives, and strategizing means of making disaster survivors more active agents in their own recovery. He has an MA and PhD in folklore from Indiana University. Our second moderator is Mary Hufford. She's a visiting professor of folklore in the Department of English at The Ohio State University, and also associate director of the Livelihoods Knowledge Exchange Network. Her publications on heritage are at the nexus of nature and culture, and they include an edited volume, Conserving Culture, a new discourse on heritage. Her most recent writing on sustainability engages narrative ecologies of the Central Appalachian Forest Commons. She has her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, Department of Folklore and Folklife. And the third moderator is Robert Barron, who's on the faculty of the Masters of Arts program in Cultural Sustainability at Goucher College. He's a member of the steering committee of the ICH NGO Forum, where he also serves as a representative of the International Society for Ethnology and Folklore. He served for many years as director of the Folk Arts program of the New York Council on the Arts. He's written extensive publications on public folklore, heritage studies, museums, and folk life, including public folklore and creolization as cultural creativity. He also has his PhD in folklore and folk life from the University of Pennsylvania. So now I'll turn it over to Robert Barron.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy. Oops, hang on.
You're mute.
Muted, yep, here I am. We're thrilled to have so many participants from so many different places, so many different countries around the world. And I'm just looking for my remarks. Bear with me a second. And heritage, of course, has become a subject of discourse increasingly as a public policy issue, as a cultural practice, and as a matter of discourse in academic fields and in the public sphere. It's viewed, the contemporary view of heritage is as constructivist. It's viewed dynamically. It's as much about the past as about the present. And this dynamic view of heritage is a paradigm shift from what we've looked at in the past about heritage. And we're happy to look at these different dimensions of heritage in our seminary in a webinar day. I found my notes. Pardon me, my stumbling. It's nice to have a little vulnerability and human touch here, and we look at heritage as much about the present as the past, as representations of the past and the present. Heritage is now seen as integrative of environment and culture, and both material and intangible heritage are increasingly seen as intertwined. Heritage is a source of pride and cultural cohesion. It's something that counters the deracination and alienation in contemporary life. It also can serve as a bridge between communities as mutual engagement. It's also been, of course, manipulated for political and nationalist purposes. It's been weaponized, and it's commoditized through tourism productions. We'll be covering all these issues in our webinar today. Heritage interventions by government and cultural specialists inevitably change cultural practices and how people relate to these practices. Community agency is critically important in shaping and determining how heritage is practiced and represented. And many of us are developing ways to share and yield authority with the communities and groups with whom we work through co-creation practices. In the United States, for the past half century, public folklore practice and theory became a major dimension of our folklore discipline, which has been paralleled since the beginning of this century by the intangible cultural heritage safeguarding movement spurred by UNESCO, which is happening elsewhere in the world. Unfortunately, we've had limited scholarship that encompasses both public folklore and heritage studies, with notable exceptions like the special issue in 2018 of the International Journal of Heritage Studies, edited by Michelle Stefano. We hope that our webinar today will open up new dialogue on all the topics we're considering, with our conversations continuing on chat and in the follow-up salon. So please be active and chat with your comments and questions, and also for ideas for salon topics. So I see we already have a very active chat, and we have, 248 participants. Our first speaker today, Valdemar Hofstein, is unusually well suited to lead off our dialogue. Valdemar is professor of folklore, ethnology, and museum studies at the University of Iceland. He chaired Iceland's Commission for UNESCO. He served as president of the International Society for Ethnology and Folklore, and is the author of a number of important works on heritage, including Making Intangible Heritage, El Condor Pasa, and Other Stories from UNESCO, and with Martin Skidstrup, Patrimonialities. He has a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and Valdemar is a truly transoceanic scholar, writing about heritage theory, policy, and practice in publications that have wide resonance from his island nation in the North Atlantic. So pleased to hear from you, Valdemar, and welcome.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Amy and Mary and Norma and Jessica for inviting me and for arranging this. Coming to you here from Iceland, where things are not too bad. As a measure of that, I just came out of the public pool, which is open. On the other hand, the volcano next to Reykjavik may just be going off 30 minutes from here, so we'll see how we get through the lecture. All right. The 19th century came up with a brilliant term to help people reflect on rapid change in everyday life. The term, of course, is folklore. This innovative term helped people to wrap their minds around transformations by providing a benchmark against which to measure them. While we have later outfitted the concept of folklore for other uses, the field of folklore at its inception was about documenting and annotating through the rear view mirror the social, economic, and environmental transformations that came to be described as industrialization, urbanization, modernity. The field of folklore benchmarked these changes through multiple media and institutions which it took part in building: museums, collections, exhibitions, concerts, books, magazines, sound recordings, films, spectacles, festivals, local history societies, university chairs and departments, archives, arts councils, well, the folklore field as we know it, built up over the course of the past 200 years as part of the public sphere of modern society. Taken together, its media and its institutions helped to develop what Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett calls a metacultural relationship to some select practices, expressions, and environments that they depicted as folk. These institutions and media have developed, of course, to keep up with the circumstances and challenges of each successive generation. So when folklorists today speak of folklore, there is only partial overlap with what our predecessors 150 years ago had in mind. When we speak of folk, we're referring to vernacular practices, expressive culture, and the aesthetics of everyday life. But there was something particular, I think, in the social transformations of the 19th century and the early 20th century, to which the field of folklore responded at its inception. The folklore field, with its institutions and media, provided a historically specific response, an intellectual but also an emotional response for certain classes in certain societies to their own rapidly changing circumstances, to what Raymond Williams called the structures of feeling particular to that period. In part, it was a historically specific way of conceptualizing, seeing, and feeling a relationship to time, distinguishing the past from the present, and conceiving of overlaps and overflows between tradition and modernity. In part, it was also about conceptualizing diversity, that is to say, to collect, display, and relate to diverse ways of seeing the world and diverse ways of being in the world, diverse ways of living and expressing oneself in the face of what people experienced at the time as the bulldozers of modernity leveling out all such differences in the name of progress. The concept of folklore and the institutions and media of the folklore field help people to reflect on this process and to come to grips with it. Now, I open with this perspective on the history of folklore because I think it's instructive to mirror our present moment in it, with the rise of the concept of cultural heritage over the past 50 years and the formation of the heritage field with its multiple media and various institutions. There are obvious continuities, but there are also important differences. There is something particular in the social transformations, I think, of the late 20th and early 21st centuries to which the current concern for cultural heritage responds. The heritage field, too, provides a historically specific response then, a way of coming to grips with the circumstances and challenges of the present and the previous decades, over the course of which we have been witness to a proliferation of heritage, over the course of which the number of things and the kinds of things we refer to as cultural heritage have grown exponentially, and the number of people and the kinds of people who referred to cultural heritage has also grown exponentially. Some of these particular transformations and challenges include those that we associate with globalization, neoliberalization, decolonization, mass migration, as well as mass media and mass tourism. The institutions and media of the heritage field provide us with a menu of means to conceptualize contemporary circumstances, challenges, and changes, and to bring them into focus, to put them up for debate, to accept, to object, to promote, and to protest, to relate to them, in other words, and to feel them through the full range of heritage emotions, from admiration, attachment, and pride, through to shock, anger, and indignation. In addition to the concept of folklore, I find it helpful to compare the concept of cultural heritage also to another powerful concept, that of the environment. Both cultural heritage and the environment are recent terms, coined in the 19th century. Both entered common speech only in the last 50 years, and both only became as ubiquitous as they are today in the last 25, 30 years. Now, despite their recent vintage, these concepts are incredibly powerful. Activist groups organize around them. They are forced to reckon with in public opinion and public policy, and authoritative institutions have formed around them. There's no question as to whether the environment actually exists. It's a category of things, an instrument for classifying the world and therefore also for changing it. And categories of this kind have a performative power. They make themselves real. By acting on the world, molding it in their image, they bring themselves into being. Now, if the environment is one such concept, cultural heritage is another. Much like the environment, cultural heritage is a novel category of things lumped together in innovative ways under its rubric. Buildings, monuments, swords, songs, jewelry, visual patterns, religious paraphernalia, literature, healing dances, woodcarving traditions. Things, in other words, that have nothing in common, except the fact that we see them through the same lens as cultural heritage and act on them through the same means. The things themselves are not new, but heritage is an innovative way to think about them. It offers new ways to relate to them and new ways to act on them. Like the environment, then, heritage does not seek to describe the world, it changes the world. Like the environment, the major use of cultural heritage is to mobilize people and resources. It's to reform discourses and to transform practices. Now, intangible cultural heritage, in which many of us attending this webinar take an interest, is a prime example of this, I think. It is a truly ugly term, I think it's fair to say, and it's so unwieldy that some people actually prefer the acronym ICH, which is even less graceful if that is possible. Although I noticed that the closed captioning for this event rendered it as Ice Age, which is actually perfect, bringing together cultural heritage and climate change in a way. And yet, within a few years from its coining, people in various corners of the world have come to refer to their own practices as their ICH. Governments and NGOs have mobilized to safeguard that ICH, to promote it, to educate people about their ICH, to program it, and so on. And in so doing, attempt also to bring it into being, to mold the world to conform to the concept, or in other words, through safeguarding, to reform people's relationship to their own practices, and therefore also to reform the practices themselves. There's an important number of cases worldwide where such metacultural relations not only reform, but actually replace previously existing relations between people and their practices, sometimes turning even vibrant cultural practices with popular participation into intangible heritage that councils and committees have set about safeguarding, which sometimes means to control access, to regulate participation, to curate the practices in the name of safeguarding their quote-unquote authenticity. Offering protection, in other words, even when it's not always clear why protection might be needed, or from what or whom exactly, not from the authorities themselves. And I've described elsewhere such protection as a means of dispossession. There is every reason to be critical of such safeguarding measures, and there certainly is room for critical scholarship and a need for critical practice in the heritage field. That's one task for folklorists in the domain of heritage, together with colleagues trained in related fields with other names, perhaps less poetic names. And it's an important task. But there are equally important tasks at hand, work that matters, to borrow the phrase from Norma Cantu's introduction. Those of the archivist, for example, who inventories cultural practices, the curator who interprets them, the teacher who educates people about them, and the culture broker who builds bridges and brings people together across differences. These are tasks that folklorists are good at, tasks that they're equipped to do, tasks for which they can build on a long tradition of practice in the public sphere. To me, to end on a positive note, the most encouraging upshot of the concept of cultural heritage is that it brings together diverse practices and various people who before inhabited different cultural and social categories. And that, I think, is an important contribution to our common imagination, not to be underestimated. There's no finer demonstration of the performative power of concepts and their creative possibility. The concept of intangible heritage, I refuse to use ICH, invites us to imagine what unites diverse customs, practices, and expressions. What singing has in common with knitting, what building has in common with dancing, what cooking has in common with carving, or acupuncture with playing the accordion. Here lie opportunities to explore and meetings to broker. We can reach out, foster collaboration, and promote alliances. And what unites them, I think, and I take inspiration from Del Hymes here, is the aesthetic capacity to make beauty, form, and meaning out of innumerable particular circumstances. The capacity to relate to previous generations through expressions and practices that rehearse their words and sounds and gesture, and the social ability to share these with others. And I'll end on that note. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valdemar. Our next speaker, I will be introducing our next speaker here. Although foodways had by the 1990s been firmly accredited as a subfield of folklore, its recognition within the world of heritage studies and practice has lagged behind other kinds of heritage in the public eye. The traction it has gained in the US over the past 2 decades is due in no small part to the efforts of public folklorists, among whom our next speaker has been leading the way. Lucy M. Long teaches folklore, popular culture, nutrition, and tourism at Bowling Green State University and directs the Center for Food and Culture. Since the 21st century began, she has published no less than 7 books on culinary tourism, regional food culture, ethnic American cooking, a food and folklife reader, memories and meanings of comfort food, and a global history of honey. Currently, She is conducting a virtual ethnography of how people are finding comfort and discomfort through foodways during the pandemic. We are very pleased to have her with us today to lead us in exploring how folkloristic perspectives on foodways illuminate issues in heritage tourism. Please join me in welcoming Lucy Long.
Thank you, Mary. So, okay, I think that's working now. It's nice when friends are making the introductions. It's not quite as intimidating. So we were asked to come up with some questions. So the question that I'm dealing with is, does food offer distinctive ways of experiencing heritage tourism that differ from other cultural or artistic forms? And can folkloristic perspectives on food and foodways contribute to discussions and issues around heritage tourism? So this topic actually includes at least 4 disciplines, and these overlap in subject matter and practice: heritage studies, tourism studies, food studies, and folklore studies. Within those fields, there are intersections that then serve as subfields, particularly culinary tourism or food tourism. I want to focus here, though, on what a folkloristic perspective on food can contribute to issues in heritage tourism, and specifically to issues pertaining to the role of food in heritage tourism. So what are those issues? Okay, so first of all, heritage tourism is considered a niche within tourism, as well as a part of cultural tourism. Tourism scholars Dallin Timothy and Stephen Boyd point out in their introduction to the 2006 premier issue of the Journal of Heritage Tourism, and I point out the date because this is a fairly recent discipline. They say this is one of the most notable and widespread types of tourism and is among the very oldest forms of travel. Even ancient Egyptians traveled to experience historic places of cultural importance. So, and I think it is important to recognize we're dealing with a phenomena that has existed as long as there have been individuals. So heritage tourism faces the fundamental challenge that confronts tourism in general, which is the need to balance competitiveness with sustainability. Sustainability in tourism studies refers to wise use of resources in the present so that they can continue to be used in the future. So it's not about preservation. Competitiveness includes at least 3 components. First is quality of the destination or attraction. Tourists need to feel satisfied that they have received their money's worth so that they will spend more money and return. Secondly, distinctiveness of the destination attraction or attractions so that tourists will choose that place over others. Okay, and thirdly, a balance between exoticness and familiarity. It needs to be exotic enough to draw people to warrant leaving home to see it, but it needs to be familiar enough that they feel safe going there. Okay, now heritage tourism also faces all the challenges facing heritage in general. Whose heritage is being highlighted? Who gets to decide what view of history and what identities are being supported by the selections highlighted? How can those destinations be presented so that they get across the complexity and the humanity of both the past and the present? Okay, now food's role in heritage tourism until recently, and this is true of tourism in general, was not considered significant. It was more a hospitality service and a functional need rather than part of an attraction or destination. This is partly because heritage tourism focuses on built environments and material culture. Food is ephemeral. It is not meant to last, but to be consumed. So that what was usually displayed were cold artifacts, agricultural tools, storage containers, cooking implements, perhaps written recipes or cookbooks. These tend to be passive objects behind glass. They're to be preserved, not to be used. Also, food tends to be everyday and frequently in the domestic and the feminine sphere, all of which were ignored in the past as insignificant to heritages defined more by political and military exploits. Contemporary trends in heritage tourism now utilize food for the very characteristics that made it overlooked in the past. Its everydayness is thought to enable tourists to feel an emotional connection to the heritage being conveyed. They can better imagine historical figures as real people if they see the food that they eat. Homes of famous personages frequently show the table set and ready for a meal. So reminders that these were people who have the same basic needs that we have today. Similarly, food's ephemeral but multi-sensory quality encourages a fuller engagement among tourists so that they feel they have experienced the destination for themselves. They literally consume the place and the heritage it represents by partaking of food or participating in foodways activities. Castles throughout Ireland, for example, offer medieval dinners that recreate and adapt recipes from the past. Food and foodways are now considered a standard added value that can increase the quality of the tourism destination and experience and also add to its distinctiveness. Okay, so what are some of the issues around foodways in heritage tourism? I want to mention here that these are very similar issues to the heritization of food, which I don't have time to talk about today. However, heritage foods is definitely a very relevant topic here. So along with the usual issues of cultural politics over who has the authority to define the tradition and make the selections, heritage tourism is critiqued as it ossifies, crystallizes a food tradition, identifying one instance in an otherwise dynamic process as the only true product or practice. It promotes false notions of authenticity as an objective quality. It encourages the construction, even the invention of iconic foods. It also tends to encourage the creation of new meanings attached to specific foodstuffs or even cuisines. So also, foodways and heritage tourism can perpetuate systems of inequality by romanticizing colonial or racist histories. So, very, very quick rundown. So what can folklore contribute to this discussion? What exactly is a folkloristic approach to food also? And there are numerous names here that I want to mention: Don Yoder, Michael Owen Jones, Barbara Kershaw-Black Gimblett, Charlie Camp, Simon Bronner, Yvonne Lockwood. A lot of folklorists have dealt with food and should be recognized. There's several aspects of a folkloristic perspective. First, folklorists see that food of any origin, whether homemade or commercial, mass distributed or orally transmitted, can be a medium for the construction, negotiation, communication, and performance of identity, relationships, values, meaning, and power. Secondly, as matter considered appropriate for ingestion, food is a cultural, social, and personal construction rather than an objective fact. Every culture determines what is edible according to its worldview and conception of the place of humans in the universe. Social institutions and hierarchies construct notions of what is palatable or desirable to eat, reflecting status and power. Every individual then acts within those two levels of construction, but has their own experiences, personalities, values, and taste that shape their relationships with food and creates their own culinary universe. Their perceptions of food can change over time and place, and even within situations and for individuals, so that these constructions are dynamic and fluid. Food traditions constantly change, incorporating new. Thirdly, folklore scholarship and the paradigm shift from product to process expanded food to foodways. Don Yoder discussed foodways as the total system of practices, contexts, and conceptualizations around food. As a system, each component within that system affects the others, regardless of how insignificant they might seem. So shopping for groceries ends up impacting what is eaten for dinner. The size of one's refrigerator ends up impacting what is preserved and available for consumption. Also, memories, emotions, and meanings can be attached to any of the components, which then contribute to the meaningfulness of foodstuffs. And finally, folklorists approach food as an aesthetic domain. An individual can experience foodways with full engagement of the senses without knowledge of or relationship to the cultural or social identities of that food. This complicates the lines between adoption and appropriation of food, but also helps to explain how and why this happens so frequently. Individuals and groups incorporate new foodways into their diet because they enjoy taste and aesthetic experience, along with other motivations. So, that was a very quick rundown on those. Closely related to heritage tourism is the idea of culinary tourism. And within tourism studies, food tourism, gastronomic tourism is frequently defined as travel that is motivated by food. Within folklore studies, culinary tourism is defined more as an attitude of the eater. It is eating out of curiosity, the intentional voluntary participation in the foodways of an other. Okay, and within that, there's now a new focus on heritage foods. And that then draws it all back into heritage tourism. Also, though, culinary tourism as a folklore-based activity and field of scholarship is essentially a field of public folklore. It is taking the ideas out to the public. It is dealing with the public. And as such, it is done in collaboration with the communities involved and with a holistic understanding of how these food traditions are functioning within the community. This then makes the culinary tourism projects compatible with sustainability. So applying these ideas to foodways and heritage tourism, hopefully, will help ensure that these projects enable foodways traditions to be dynamic, fluid, relevant, and ideally socially just. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Really appreciated that. My business now is to introduce our next speaker. Uffe Ronström is professor of ethnology at Uppsala University's Gotland campus. And I believe we have a visual here, Jessica. His expertise in numerous publications center on traditional music, genre theory, and above all, island studies, a topic central to his life and his reason for being here today. Uffe was born on the island where he now teaches. You see it there, the largest island in the Baltic Sea, where 60,000 people live year-round and 2 million tourists visit yearly, attracted by the capital Visby, pictured there, and by its 800-year-old stone wall, which has made it a UNESCO World Heritage Center. The money generally stays inside the wall. The vast island outside it is often excluded from what happens there. Outnumbered more than 30-1 by tourists, Uffe and his fellow islanders face daily life and death questions about how to cope ecologically, economically, and culturally. Uffe and the Gotland campus have shaped a remarkable program to address these issues. Sustainable Destinations Development, where he and his ethnologist colleagues teach the heritage track, working with specialists in the eco-sciences and business departments to strategize ways to make tourism benefit the host culture and the environment as much as it benefits the tourists. In 2019, about 90 students from 30 nations enrolled in the Sustainable Destinations Development Program. And as a visitor, I was deeply impressed by the zeal and commitment of the faculty and the students who had come to Gotland with a sense of mission to help save the world. I'm not exaggerating here. I believe that Uffe and his colleagues are creating a model through which folklorists and other heritage specialists can work with host communities to help these communities attain the power and the place that they deserve in defining what constitutes sustainable cultural and environmental heritage. So please welcome Uffe Ronström.
Thank you. Thank you. I see that my name is captioned as Rolling Stone. It could be worse. Yeah. Okay, I'm speaking from Visby, Gotland, here in the Baltic Sea, and I will pick up from one or two of the threads we've heard about from Valdemar's and Lucy's presentations. Here in Campus Gotland, Uppsala University, we have taught and researched folklore and heritage during a little more than 2 decades. When this campus opened in 1998, a number of newly employed lecturers in ethnology, art studies, human geography, and archaeology looked around and asked, what can we make of this place? So I suggested to start by looking at how Visby, just a few years before, had become Sweden's 6th and the world's around 470th UNESCO World Heritage Site. And inspired by, among others, Barbara Kirstenblatt-Gimblett, who is with us today here, who visited us in this period, I set up a long-term program on heritage politics. Much of our work then focused on globalizing processes, how a worn-out small town like Visby, through intensive heritage production, could become a medieval icon and a major tourist magnet on a global market. So we followed the producers, the branding, the image production, the launching, so on. And this work eventually became one of the founding stones of critical heritage studies in Sweden. And then in 2015, we launched yet another multidisciplinary long-term research and educational program called Sustainable Visits. Now we wanted to go the other way around and focus on localizing process. That is how global forces like markets, trends, and things like that take place. And what actually happens when a place like Visby, still a small town with around 24,000 inhabitants, is visited by 1 million or 2. If local or regional identity is a reflective social phenomenon, that is, if we become what we see reflected in the eyes of the others, what then if the others come in millions and look at the inhabitants as part of the attraction, as islanders, as a bounded group, remote in space and in time, and with the funny language, odd and old-fashioned habits, traditions and rituals, and a rich ancient heritage. So we set out to study as many aspects of visit and visiting we could come up with. The effects of the new cruise pier, tour guiding, branding, image production, entrepreneurship in the tourist industry, how visitors move and behave, conflicts between stakeholders, and not least for our part, what we could learn about the use, importance, and meaning of heritage and folklore. And all this now was to be analyzed through a lens that was new to us all, sustainability. So the next step was to launch this international multidisciplinary program, Sustainable Destination Development, which would address 2 main questions: how destinations can develop more sustainably, and how destination development itself can contribute to sustainability. This program has 3 tracks that students can choose from. One about nature-based destinations, the other is applied heritage politics, and the third, entrepreneurship for destination development. And up to 90 students from all over the world study with us in this program. Of course, this and last year, mostly online. What they all work on, using their different backgrounds and perspectives, are aspects of destination production, focusing on the interface between the visitors and the visited from a local and bottom-up perspective. And we, as ethnologists, are responsible for the applied heritage politics track. Our teaching focus upon heritage as a concept, as construct, ideas, and ideology, and of course as praxis, how, why, and when heritage is actually articulated, used, understood, and of course also what the outcome is for destinations like Visby and Gotland, and for the islanders. A starting point is the notion of heritage and its many uses and meanings around the world. And it's important to know here that in Swedish, the word is kulturarv, literally meaning culture inheritances. This word kulturarv was imported to Swedish in the 1980s directly from UNESCO's World Heritage Convention, which actually happened in Stockholm in 1972. And today there are many different usages and meanings, but the core still is buildings, monuments, and sites. This has meant that in Sweden, heritage from start has come with a clear connection to destinations and tourism. And in Visby, the heritageization was from the beginning tightly linked to the tourist industry, as one of the main goals was to create a globally visible destination brand and raise the number of visitors. Also, taken together, tourism and heritage come in Sweden with a positive aura as the savior, especially for small, marginalized or peripheral places. In a heavily centralized state like Sweden, that will mean an ever-increasing number of places, and especially islands. The connection between islands, marginalization, heritageization, and tourism is tight in Sweden, as also in many other parts of the world. So by shifting from a focus on heritage production as a globalizing process to localizing process, the notion of heritage politics have become even more central to us. During the last years, we have come to spend more energy on the second part, politics, and now in the light also of island studies and not least sustainability studies, which actually through the initiatives of lecturers and students in only a few years have become a core of most of educational programs at our campus. So in places like Visby, where heritage, islandness, tourism, and sustainability now mingle in historically new ways, we find it necessary to follow the outcomes as close as possible. What our studies has shown is that the heritage production in Visby and Gotland, with that has come more tourists and more wealthy tourists, to the extent that gentrification has become a threat to the islanders, in the sense that nowadays it's difficult or even impossible to find affordable housing. Other results is that even if increased heritage production and tourism have boosted parts of the island economy, it has also led to increased identification in terms of remoteness, otherness, and marginalization, which in turn has strengthened the alienation and ambivalence among the islanders towards their own life world. And to that come an acute water shortage due to the large number of visitors, the increasing pollution of the Baltic Sea, which is already the world's most polluted sea, and the CO2 emissions from cruise ships, ferries, aeroplanes, and a number of other issues, of course. So what we have is an island with a nice climate, extremely rich history, a medieval town, and an astoundingly rich folklore, and a lot of visitors. What we urgently need is to find ways to have all these and enough fresh water, affordable housing, jobs also outside of the tourist and heritage sectors, and not least to have it in ways that acknowledges the legacy of the islanders and their heritage, if you wish, without leading to further marginalization and othering. It is in this light we have decided to go on by focusing more on how heritage relate to sustainability, and also to include a more proactive applied part and design our program, the Sustainable Destination Development Program, to address the two main questions: how our studies of heritage can help destinations develop more sustainably, and how we can help destination development itself to contribute to a more sustainable world. So in conclusion, and echoing perhaps Naomi Klein here, the insight we have gained from all this is that the sustainability issue really changes it all. And in conclusion, to what extent, the question is, To what extent is heritage and heritage production part of the solution or part of the problem? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ofe, for outlining and foregrounding many of the challenges in achieving sustainable tourism. Tourism is rarely not a consequence of ICH activities and frequently public folklore. It's good and bad and ugly and more often than not, perhaps always ambiguous. Tourism is one of the topics that can be pursued in the question and answer part of our session today. Also, think about what you might want to include in the salon discussions as our running conversation through the webinar and following from the webinar. And please use the chat to suggest some ideas for that. And we can center our salons around the key topics that you're interested in. Moving on to our next speaker, I'd like to say that there's been a very big shift in heritage practice that's been marked by a turn from top-down authority held by the cultural specialist who mediates, interprets, and represents the cultural practices of a community and group. And our next speaker, Diana Njai, has developed pioneering approaches for co-curation and enabling communities to represent their cultural practices on their own terms. I've learned a lot personally and professionally from Diana about how we should engage with communities ever since we worked together 3 decades ago in the formative years of the Folk Arts program of the New York State Council on the Arts. She's a senior curator at the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, where she curated Smithsonian Folklife Festival programs featuring African, Caribbean, and African American cultures. She's trained community scholars and is the principal investigator for 3 Smithsonian research initiatives: the African American Craft Summit, the Crafts of African Fashion, and the Will to Adorn, a path-breaking program on African American style and the aesthetics of identity, which used social media and participants from throughout the U.S. in very imaginative and resourceful ways. The Will to Adorn is the subject of an up-and-coming book by Diana. She holds an honorary professorship at the University of Glasgow, and she has a PhD in anthropology and visual studies from the Union Institute. Diana.
Okay, thank you, Robert, and good morning, good evening, bonjour, buenos dias, nangadef, and assalamu alaikum. It is really wonderful to be here, and I'm very happy that that both the American Folklore Society and Norma, Amy, and other organizers of this seminar have agreed to do it, and I've learned a lot already. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this will work. Okay. So the folklore field, I've been and continue to be a staunch believer and an advocate for community agency in research, as well as in representation of heritage. That is to say that I believe that one of the most important things that we do is to assist in the autoethnography, in the efforts of people to examine their own heritage and to share their own heritage and to create exchanges with other communities. And I think that particularly this is important in historically marginalized and underrepresented communities. I think that heritage studies in folklore research undertaken by the folk in communities that have been colonized, enslaved, or oppressed has a liberating impact, especially if it illuminates the skills, the creativity, the stories that may have been previously suppressed. These are histories of courage, of resilience, of sustainability, and they combat the crass stereotypes that arise in the course of this oppression and that are part of the psychological oppression. I think that there is worth in people interviewing the generations that went before them, but also the generations that are ahead of them, and then sharing what they have researched with others in the public sphere. I think that this is something that is shared with many of my colleagues in the public sector, as well as both the, I'm going to mention my colleagues who have been also pioneers in community scholarship and those who have written on it. I want to mention, for example, Betty Belenis, Marjorie Hunt. They're at the Center for Folklife, as well as many others in many other places. I think that one of the most appropriate roles that one can take as a folklorist is to facilitate, aid and abet people's interrogation and investigation of their own heritage. And the projects that I've worked on in the past few decades, I'm going to talk a little bit about because I think, and things that I've heard really illuminate this. In the Bahamas, there was a program called Are We Building More Hotels and Losing Ground? And as a part of that program, one of the things was two people in smaller towns and villages in the Bahamas about cultural heritage and intangible cultural heritage specifically. It's around the time when the UNESCO Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage was just being ratified, and people and different nations were considering it. And but a lot of the impulse for countries to take that on had to do with the idea of cultural tourism from the policy level. But thinking about what the investigation of cultural heritage included, one of the participants in one of these forums said, well, we don't need this for tourists. We need this for ourselves. We need our kids to know that this exists. And they went on to talk about landmarks, to talk about sites of importance, to talk about things that were not being shared with their children. Same thing in Bermuda. When we started working in Bermuda for a Folklife Festival program, the people, one person at a meeting that we gathered to talk about Bermudian heritage says, well, we don't have any heritage. We're of our own. We're British subjects, and we are our heritage is whatever comes over. But by the end of the program, not only through their own investigation of their own culture, they were not only able to articulate what were precisely Bermudian, what was shared, what was the different culturally diverse aspects of Bermudian culture, but also the importance of sharing that with themselves and others. So that said, in our love as folklorists of the Heritage Project, we have to recognize that there is a dark side to community self-representation of heritage. There's a dark side to the presentation. We were all dismayed by the revelations of white supremacy, of neocolonialism, and nativist movements in the United States, which was which has been and continues to be in the front of the news, as well as that taking place in other countries. I think it's something that is a unfortunate use of heritage. And there have been also false equivalencies drawn between the assertion of, for example, white Christian heritage, emboldened by our last administration. There were not fine people on either side of this conversation. Some of it, the equation of the Confederate flag being the same as wearing kente cloth as a symbol of African identity. For those who may not be familiar with this, at one point during the passage of a civil rights law, a civil rights procedure in honoring John Lewis, and incredible fighter for civil rights, members of Congress wore kente cloth. And kente cloth being a traditional cloth worn by Ghanaian royalty, but now adopted by African Americans as a symbol of universal heritage. And I'm going to sort of go through some of these slides, which I realize I've not been showing here. Okay. And there were accusations that, Ghanaians were involved in the slave trade, so this is equivalent to the use of the Confederate flag, which continues to strike terror within African American communities. Well, the thing is that the fallacy is based on delusions of superiority and movement heritage that has as a basic thrust a nostalgia for the oppression of others. It's not the same. And so while it is important for communities to interrogate heritage, and for all communities to have the tools to interrogate heritage, we have to recognize that the study of heritage, the maintenance of heritage, the continuation, and even the sustainability has weight and is differently weighed and differently valued. Lynching is an unfortunate part of the American tradition. There were lynching parties, which at the time people may have expressed nostalgia for, maybe not openly, but it's very clear that there are two sides to the story of heritage and two sides for the investigation of heritage studies. For the investigation of heritage. But the heritage of resistance, and I'm going to share my screen again. I can't share my screen again, okay. Let me put that. The investigation of heritage and the heritage of resistance of civil rights movement, notions of identity and dress, if they are regarded in a way that leads to dialogue, are very, very important parts of what needs to be the role of folklorists, and not to shy away, but to work collaboratively to explore both the negatives and the negative aspects, or the destructive aspects, and the constructive aspects of tradition. That, to me, has been part of the tradition of the Folklife Festival, to bring people together from diverse communities. That has been part of the transformative power, and that is part of the importance of building skills, not only among folklorists who have degrees in folklore or in any of the adjacent fields, but also, as my colleague has talked about, Folklife, both the localizing project that giving them the strategies to investigate their own work, their own cultural origins, and how they interact with other, and how they interplay with other heritages. So to conclude, my question is, the self-study and public affirmation of community heritage is a double-edged sword. It can be liberating and decolonializing and unifying. It can also be divisive, racist, and a tool of demagogues. How can we promote and support agency and self-determination in the study and presentation of heritage in a way that is anti-racist, anti-colonialist, and encourages mutual respect, understanding, and appreciation? And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Diana, for that, particularly for illuminating the contribution folklorists can and should be making to the critique of this dark and very disturbing side of heritage discourse. We are getting some really great questions in the chat, by the way, which we will have to revisit. Following, we have two more speakers that are coming up here. Our next speaker, I had the great good fortune of getting to know our next speaker when I was a Folklife specialist at the Library of Congress in the 80s and 90s. My work at the American Folklife Center reckoned with the policy implications of recognizing that natural resources have social and cultural functions. Jeff Titon's 1988 Powerhouse for God offered an early model in our field of a robust cultural ecology of an agrarian Baptist community in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Over the past 20 years, his research and writings have marked heads of numerous trails connecting folklore to emerging subfields of studies in sustainability, ecomusicology, eco-justice, and collaborative ethnography. As professor emeritus at Brown University, he has not slowed down. Toward a Sound Ecology, New and Selected Essays was just published by Indiana University Press. Around the time of that publication, the American Folklore Society bestowed on him the Lifetime Scholarly Achievement Award. We are delighted to welcome folklorist, ethnomusicologist, and longtime organic farmer and mentor to so many of us, Jeff Todd Titon.
Thank you, Mary. Can you all see me? I don't see myself, but that's hello. Am I here?
We see you, Jeff.
Okay, good. I can't see myself very well. That's probably better that way. Greetings from Egamogan Reach in East Penobscot Bay, Maine, the traditional land of the Wabanaki, who are still here. Egamogan means land of the fish weirs, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about fishing. The assigned topic that I was given was public folklore, heritage, and environmental sustainability. I want to talk with you about experiential knowledge as heritage. When experiential knowledge is mediated by cultural tradition and put to use in living one's life, it becomes folk life or cultural heritage. So I begin with a story about the cultural heritage of folk life. It's the kind of cultural heritage that rests in local knowledge about the environment. I'll ask you to keep this story in mind as I reference the 2005 United Nations Millennium Assessment Report on Ecosystems and Human Well-Being, and its more recent manifestation in the 2018 UN Regional Assessment for the Americas report from the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBS for short. These collaborative science-informed documents are major international efforts to guide decision makers towards wise and sustainable use of environmental resources. First, the story. In 1979, I bought a summer house here on Deer Isle, an island off the coast of Maine. In retirement, I live here year-round. Its working waterfront is important in the state of Maine's lobster fishing industry, which today is worth nearly $500 million. You've all tasted lobster, I hope. It's one of the great delights of this world. The Maine coastal lobster fishery is a classic example of a commons. From the 1840s through the 1930s, it was an unregulated commons. Anyone could set their baited traps in the waters near the shore and haul them up with a winch on account of haul them up with a winch using a traditional locally built skiff, a boat called a pea pod on account of its shape. Jessica, do you have the slide? Could you share the screen for a moment? There's a picture of a pea pod, and the lobster fisherman is standing up in the pea pod rowing the boat. That's the traditional way of rowing it. In the back, his companion is holding up a lobster in each hand, and you can see the lobster trap on the gunwale of the boat. Okay, Jessica, would you be kind enough to take that slide down? That's it for the slides. No more slides. By the end of the 19th century, lobstering was Maine's most valuable fishery. Live and canned lobster was exported out of state. While some boats became motorized, the traps were hauled up with power winches. Productivity increased to meet the demand. But the lobster populations went through boom and bust cycles until conservation measures were introduced in the 1930s, and the fishery became a regulated commons. Some were science-guided state regulations, such as limiting the catch to lobsters within a certain size. Based in their experiential knowledge, the fishermen and women themselves took up other conservation measures, such as limits on the numbers of boats in a given area and the catch, release, and V-notching of egg-bearing females. Taken together, these measures smoothed the up and down population cycles of the lobsters, but didn't eliminate them. Incidentally, the Passamaquoddy tribe of Native Americans who live on the furthest down East Maine coast manage their own fishery in a similar fashion. You might have heard of the lobster conflict going on in Nova Scotia between the Micmac and the settler colonialists. Maine doesn't have that because Maine doesn't impose seasonal limits on lobstering, but there is conflict over eel fishing between the Passamaquoddy and the state government of Maine, but that's another story. However, in the early 1990s, Maine's lobster population was in steep decline. And then the state fish and wildlife scientists diagnosed the cause as overfishing, and they proposed to the state legislature that there be a severe moratorium on fishing. A Deer Isle lobsterman and citizen scientist named Ted Ames was skeptical. The moratorium might save the lobsters, but it would sink the fishing industry. Like most of the people on the island, he was convinced that the lobster population was down because scallop draggers were tearing up the ocean bottoms, where the female lobsters laid their eggs. Ames knew that lobsters had favorite spawning grounds, but he didn't know just where they were. And so he interviewed the oldest fishermen and women in the district, and in their oral histories, he found out where the spawning grounds had been and where they most likely were now. And so Ames and the local representative to the state legislature proposed something different than a moratorium. Instead, they would prohibit all fishing, but only in those designated areas where the lobsters were thought to lay their eggs. The legislature surprisingly agreed to give it a try, and the lobster population rebounded, and Ted Ames received a MacArthur Genius Grant, and with the money, he started a lobster research institute. Now, I'd like you to consider this story in light of the 2005 United Nations Millennium Assessment Report on Ecosystems and Human Well-Being, and its more recent manifestation in the 2018 IPBES assessments. These assessments and recommendations impose an economic calculus upon human well-being and the environment. Their framework is economic rationality. An economic rationalist conceives of the environment as a natural resource for human beings. That is, the environment is natural capital. Natural capital provides ecosystem services. Ecosystem services include materials for food, clothing, shelter, fuel, manufacturing, recreation, and so forth. These ecosystem services are quantifiable in terms of market dollars. The reports state that ecosystems provide other services, which they call cultural services. Cultural services that they identify include education, beauty, inspiration, physical and mental health, and what they term identity support through sense of place, purpose, and the sacred. Also among the cultural services that ecosystems provide are indigenous, traditional, and local knowledges. This is the kind of experiential knowledge that the old people provided to Ted Ames about the lobster spawning beds. The financial value of the older people's experiential knowledge is calculable in terms of the dollar equivalent of the lobster catch. Yet, there are also experiential values of lobster fishing that are culturally mediated, affective, and incalculable. My late friend Hap Collins told me the old saying that lobster fishing gets into your blood, and when it does, then you're no good for anything else. He spoke about taking pleasure in the beauty of fishing when you're starting out in your lobster boat at dawn, and the ocean smoke is clearing off, the air is starting to warm up, the water is calm, and you have a cup of coffee in your hands, and you're approaching an area where your lobster buoys and your traps are, and you anticipate the catch of the day. This, too, is part of the cultural heritage of lobster. I know something of what Hap meant because I went fishing with him and experienced it for myself. Hap told me if he couldn't go fishing, he might as well die. And when he couldn't, he did. The IPBES report admits it's hard to calculate the economic value of some ecosystem services, especially when conflicts arise among stakeholder populations having different worldviews. I quote from the report. While attempts at monetization of ecosystem services may lead to some insights on the values of nature, broader considerations related to spirituality, cultural identity, or social cohesion are not easily characterized in this value system, making them too often underrepresented in decision-making and in scientific assessments at sub-regional and regional levels. Thus, a multiplicity of valuation methodologies will be needed, as well as methods for combining the results in ways that do not selectively favor one worldview over another. Such methodologies and strategies for combining results are not yet fully developed. If one's conception of the environment is that it exists to service human beings with its natural capital, is it even possible, though, to develop methodologies and strategies for incorporating cultural values where heritage is concerned? Does it make any sense, I say, to speak of an economy of contemplation? Or do we have here a confusion of economic value with cultural values? Finally, some questions. Please consider lobster fishing in light of the UN and IPBES assessments and recommendations. What are the consequences of thinking of folklife and the environment as natural capital, providing ecosystem services that include cultural heritage, whose financial worth must be measured? Should public folklorists and other heritage practitioners endorse and work within this predominant contemporary policy paradigm, one that considers the environment to consist primarily of economic assets with measurable market values that enter into cost-benefit analyses during resource allocation planning and decision-making? And more broadly, is it wise to overlook the fact that thinking of the environment as natural capital is what got the world into its current environmental emergency in the first place? Global warming, extinctions, and pandemics? Is it wise to think that having failed spectacularly in trying to control nature, the solution is for human beings to try to control nature more? Are other experiential frames more desirable, such as an eco-justice frame, which recognizes that human beings are not the only beings with natural rights to life, liberty, and self-actualization? That after all, if they are natural rights, then surely nature has them also. That is the cultural heritage of Aldo Leopold and Henry David Thoreau. Does it make sense to think about environmental rights and obligations relationally and interdependently? That if we are all kin, then we are all responsible for one another. That is the cultural heritage of many indigenous peoples. And as Ralph Ellison concluded his marvelous novel, Invisible Man, who knows but that on the lower frequencies, I speak for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Let me get, for some reason, I don't know if I'm showing up here. Okay. Thank you so much for that jolt of vicarious infusion of experiential knowledge, and a side trip to Penobscot Bay, which was very refreshing, and for introducing the problem of the capitals framework for heritage studies, and so many other terms that we will be eager to explore when we get to our discussion. Our next and final speaker for this morning is so well known that she doesn't need an introduction, but she's going to get one anyway. Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimblett has profoundly shaped the course of folklore studies over the past 4 decades. Following the trail laid out in her list of publications, wait, I'm looking for my notes here, sorry. Talks given, courses taught, boards served, one sees multiple moments that have generated new subfields of folklore. Folklore and aging, folklore of immigrant groups, foodways, tourist productions, and more. While building bridges between folklore and allied fields and between academic and public venues, new bridges. The recipient of numerous awards and recognitions, she was most recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Notably, for the present webinar, Barbara's theorizing of heritage studies in the 1990s, Heritage, a New Mode of Cultural Production, centered folklorists within that realm of study and practice a full decade before it gained traction among anthropologists. Barbara's métier is theorizing from practice, and her theorizing has illuminated pathways through some of the field's thorniest crises. Mistaken Dichotomies, 1988, her analysis of the public sector academic divide, helped set the stage for folklore practice as public intellectual work on civil society, work that, as she reminded us during the 2020 AFS meeting, is urgently needed now from folklorists in both academic and public institutions. No one has done more to inspire that work than Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimblett. Please welcome her.
Thank you very much, Mary. I wanted to thank Amy, Mary, and Robert for organizing today's session, and to say how intellectually stimulating and also moving are these presentations. And it is a kind of reunion and also a call to action. And I think it's fitting that what I want to talk about today comes last, and in a way it circles round to the very, very beginning, to Valdemar and all the way through the various presentations. And I'm going to share my screen. Just a second. I hope I have the right image here. I do. Okay. Because I've taken as the title for my presentation, Anticipatory Heritage. This might also be called Prospective Heritage. And so it starts really, well, it will start, let me do it by way of introduction. It starts from a way of thinking that I formulated some time ago, and that is heritage as a mode of cultural production that has recourse to the past and produces something new. Now that is a way of thinking that I found really quite productive, and it is accompanied by a second proposition, and that is that heritage is a mode of cultural production adds value to the outmoded by making it into an exhibition of itself. So that was my starting point some time ago. And central to my argument is the notion that heritage is created through metacultural operations that extend museological values and methods, such as collection, documentation, preservation, presentation, evaluation, interpretation, to living persons, their knowledge, practices, artifacts, social worlds, and life spaces. And I was prompted to rethink that way of considering heritage, and want to share with you my reflections from a year of COVID-19. And what I'd like to propose is heritage as a mode of cultural production that has recourse to the present, to a present that is not yet past, that heritage as a mode of cultural production, having recourse to the present that is not yet past, is a prospective way of thinking about heritage. That is to say, heritage in anticipation of a future when the present will be past. And the same metacultural operations are there, but they're there in the face of the ephemeral rather than the obsolescent. And that relationship between the ephemeral and the obsolescent, between the present that is not yet past, but is imagined past in a future, that as opposed to heritage as a metacultural operation on cultural practices that are viewed as obsolescent or as requiring something to add value to them. So that's the shift I want to make from metacultural operations in the face of the ephemeral, which is to say the present moment, rather than in relation to the obsolescent. So then these operations are being applied to an unfolding present rather than to a disappearing past. And therefore, we are, in a sense, confronted with the challenge and the opportunity, and indeed the imperative to collect the present. In other words, we can call it contemporary collecting. How does this differ from notions that we've worked with in the past, like traditionalizing from Del Himes, or the idea of emergent traditions? And so, in essence, this year, but not only this year, in fact, I'm going to suggest a couple of other moments that have been very fruitful for my thinking. I would say they bring into focus the issue of time, of temporality, and a kind of perception or experience of time that is specific to crisis, that is specific to moments in the present that are being experienced as already historical. And what does it mean as a folklorist, an ethnographer, a heritage specialist? What does it mean to collect the present, a present that is unfolding, that is experienced as already historical before it's over, before it's past? And I'd like to anchor this proposition in three cases that I have found inspiring, but especially in relation to to where we are right now. My first case is from the period of the Second World War and from the Warsaw Ghetto. It must all be recorded with not a single fact omitted. And when the time comes, as it surely will, let the world read and know what the murderers have done. And this is from the Oinik Shabbos archive. It's in fact from an archive that was created in secret on pain of death by a team of volunteers of approximately 60 people under the leadership of Emanuel Ringelblum in the Warsaw Ghetto to document and record everything that was going on in the ghetto and also beyond, based on reports, letters, what refugees arriving at the ghetto could tell, couriers, and the like. And this is a photograph of Jews being forced to actually build the wall around the ghetto in Warsaw, where they were then incarcerated. And then them being moved into the ghetto, the crowding in the ghetto, and during the Great Deportation in the summer of 1942, and again just before the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April of 1943, those who were part of this clandestine archive called Oinik Shabbos, they realized, well, when they were forming the archive in the beginning, they believed that they would survive the war, and after the war, they would write a history of the Warsaw Ghetto based on the archive. In other words, they had a sense that though they didn't know what was going to happen next, they didn't actually know how this history would end, at least at the very beginning. Eventually they did, of course. They had a sense that what was happening to them was already historical, and that they needed immediately and urgently to collect and record absolutely everything on the spot and in the very, very moment. In other words, it's real-time collecting, in real time. And when they realized that they were unlikely to survive, they packed up the archive in tin boxes and in milk cans, and they buried it. And then after the war, when the Germans had demolished the ghetto and left it as an ocean of rubble, 3 members of this team who did survive managed to navigate their way through the rubble and find one of the locations where the archive had been hidden, and were able to excavate it and to unpack the milk cans, the tin boxes. The archive was found at 2 different moments in time. And so I would say that my experience with that event really sensitized me to what it means to be experiencing the present as already historical, and anticipating a moment in the future when the present would be past, and collecting and documenting in real time, contemporary collecting the present. So, and this particular archive, also known as the Ringgold Archive, has been inscribed in UNESCO's list, the list of the Register of World Memory, not on the World Heritage list, but on the list of Memory of the World, which, to my way of thinking, is another kind of heritage list. It's just formulated somewhat differently, but I think actually that's an interesting list for us to look at in relationship to intangible heritage, tangible heritage, etc. And it also raises another question, which maybe in the discussion we can answer, or at least we can discuss, and that is, I would say, whether it is possible, but that is to say, heritage, if you will, that is linked to an emotional economy that is key to feelings of shame, and the question of whether it is possible to feel shame and also pride. And it is part of a very complicated dynamic in the relationship of Poles and Jews to this very dark chapter in the history of World War II. The second moment is, of course, 9/11, 20 years ago. In this coming September will be exactly 20 years ago. And I'm really struck by the difference between this event and our COVID-19 pandemic year, and going on now for probably, you could say, 2 years, if not even longer, in terms of its residual effects and its aftermath, which we will be living with for some time. And with the case of 9/11, and the contrast is really very, very striking. This was a singular event in one day, in 3 places, and the most iconic of those 3 places was, of course, the World Trade Towers. And the response to it was one of great solidarity, not only nationwide, but worldwide, incredible solidarity. And the overall, I would say, set of practices associated and in response to it were memorial. And also it was a folklorist's dream, in the sense that so many of those responses were vernacular. And because it was not a pandemic situation, we could go out onto the streets and we could observe firsthand what was actually happening as it was unfolding. The situation during this pandemic year is of a completely different order. And so I think these are very familiar images, and there are some analogies with our pandemic year, because I'm thinking of Kay Turner's very important memorial project, but it's really of a completely different order. And just to give you a sense of the, I would say, the tsunami of responses, at least in the case of New York City, the city was absolutely blanketed with memorials on, here, on railings, on dumpsters, wherever it was possible, there were memorials and massive vigils and gatherings. So it had a very particular character. I think the focus of the event and I would say the distance from the perpetrators, that is, the perpetrators were not among us, but were somewhere else, came from somewhere else. And the focus was not on the perpetrators. The focus was very, very much on the victims and those who were connected to them. So coming now to our present, and it is very, very different from 9/11, and our approach and the responses to it are very, very different. So yes, indeed, there are many similarities. That is to say, all kinds of murals, especially when streets were boarded up during political protests after George Floyd's murder. There were wooden panels to board up windows all up and down, for example, Lower Manhattan, Upper West Side, Broadway, and immediately these murals of various kinds sprang up, and they were, for the most part, I would say, they were definitely in favor of taking health precautions. In other words, I think of them as being positive, that they were in support of very, very positive messages, whether they're public health messages or social justice messages. They were generally very, 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 very positive. However, with the exception of marches, protest demonstrations connected with protests against police brutality and social injustice, I would say that most people weren't going out. That particularly, with lockdowns, shutdowns, and people who were in vulnerable categories not able to go out, I count myself among them. It was not possible to do the kind of observation that we were able to do during 9/11. However, it was precisely because people were locked in that it was possible, and not only possible, that there was a use of digital media that is unprecedented and that presents particular opportunities and challenges that I think are really interesting for folklorists who are operating in this, what I call, anticipatory or prospective heritage, so to speak. And so in an era of social distance, and nothing could be further from the sort of intimate face-to-face kinds of interactions that we associate with cultural heritage practices, we had all kinds of very interesting adaptations. In this case, this is in Helsinki, and I think these are people in a retirement center who are singing together from their balconies, obviously not able to gather together in a choir, but are able to find another way to observe social distance and still sing together. But then there were other incredible historical practices that found their place in real life. This is a painting by my father of a story that he read in the memorial book for his town in Poland of a cholera epidemic, or I think it was cholera in the 1890s, and the practice, the Jewish cultural practice of trying to get rid of the plague, to stop the plague by doing the most righteous good deed imaginable, which was to take two people who were absolutely unmarriageable. They were so poor, they were disabled, it was beyond hope. And to take those two individuals, bring them to the cemetery, marry them, bring the whole town with the musicians, and give them money to get their lives started together, and beseech the dead to intervene on behalf of the living with God to stop the plague. And sure enough, this practice continued during the pandemic. And it's called a black wedding or a black canopy. And in this case, this is the B'nai Brak, an ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in Israel. And there were several of these black weddings that were intended to dispel or to end the pandemic. But there were other, all kinds of practices that, whether these practices are one-offs and you'll never see them again, so maybe you might call them improvisations, but in a way, the malleability of dough, it could even be a kind of a metaphor for the cultural practices that we saw unfold in relation to the pandemic. And this is the Corona challah. When I first saw it, because the challah, as you know, is a festive bread that is associated with the festive meals in connection with the Sabbath and Jewish holidays. And it's usually white flour and eggs, and it's a beautiful sweet, I mean, that's not a sweet bread, but it's a lovely festive bread. And it can be made into many shapes. Usually it's braided, but there's no reason why it can't be any shape. And in this case, it's in the shape of Corona. This appeared very early, I think in March, very, very early. And at first I was so alarmed by it, I thought other people would find it disturbing and I didn't want to post it. But then I kind of got acclimated to the idea, and I still find it a very, I'm trying to imagine somebody eating it. But nonetheless, it is taking a cultural practice, which is to bake a challah, and giving it the shape that is, if you will, the shape of the present. Then how did people adapt? All right, the retirement home in Helsinki, they sang from their balconies. But here's a family that was dispersed across the globe and across the United States, and they would normally gather for the high holidays in the fall, and the tradition in their family was to bake their grandmother's apple cake and then to share it, and of course to remember her. And not being able to do that, they baked this, each of these families baked their apple cakes, and they all posted them in this long Facebook thread and shared them on Facebook. Then there were all kinds of sort of humorous ways of adapting the holiday and reflecting COVID. In this case, this was the toilet paper menorah or the Passover Seder plate. But I would say that where we could really bring our analytical skills to bear I think in a particularly useful way would be around masking and masks. And here, this is, how can I put it? I would say that, well, first of all, this issue of the mask as a symbol of tyranny and the anti-masking movement, so to speak, this actually was there with the 2017 influenza pandemic. There were, even then, there were those who were against masking, and for not dissimilar reasons. So you could say that the anti-masking is a kind of, I would say, negative, a kind of negative pandemic heritage, a heritage of the pandemic that, well, from our point of view, I'm assuming everybody that is with us today will agree that this is a catastrophic message. But the forms that it has taken in the ways in which masks have come to, I would say, give us a litmus test, a clear picture of the polarization of the moment in which we're living. These objects, I've been collecting them, and I know that museums have been collecting them, that they are iconic of the moment, and not just of the pandemic moment, but of our social and political moment. And they're very linked to the rise of hate, whether it's anti-Asian, which has spiked in ways that are most disconcerting, or anti-Semitic, and a conflation of the masking mandate or the public health advice to wear a mask with the Nazi regime and with the Holocaust, which is absolutely astonishing. And so one of the most disconcerting is a set of Holocaust, they're actually called Holocaust face masks. That was the name of the website, where these are the crematoria at Auschwitz, and this is the killing in the Ukraine of Jews into a mass grave that they were forced to dig themselves. The story of these masks, what they signify, how the creator of them, whom I interviewed and I engaged in an extensive email exchange, what he was thinking and how they function, how they work, is something that I think we could, as folklorists, untangle. But I do think of it maybe not so much as the pandemic heritage, but as the pandemic's legacy. And that is to say, what these objects will signify prospectively when the present, in the future, when the present has become past, and these objects are with us. And so now as we come to Passover, of course, there are all of these, I would say, playful ways of dealing with Passover. And these are the four sons, the evil one, the smart one, the stupid one, and the one that doesn't know how to ask. And each of them is illustrated with a different mask. The bad one won't wear the mask. The smart one wears it properly. The one that doesn't know what to, doesn't know how to ask or what to ask, and then the dumb one who just has it around his chin. So the rise of hate, of course, the old anti-Semitic tropes are with us, and then of course the coinciding of the pandemic with the Black Lives Matters movement, particularly ignited with the murder of George Floyd. And what I found fascinating about this, in other words, this fence was put up, and you know all the circumstances, and then it immediately became a wall for communicating protest. And of course, there was on the Smithsonian's side a desire to, quote, collect it. And no sooner was there that impulse that there was another sign protesting the museum's desire to actually to collect the present. So, dear DC museums, this ain't for museum credits. We did this because shit need to change. Don't take our wall. Donate instead. Well, certainly photographs of the wall, no doubt. And actually, Dwan Reese was kind enough to send this to me. And so, of course, museums are collecting. And it's really interesting, the difference between how a history museum collects, in this case, the National Museum of American History, and how folklorists would collect. I think you can even see from some of the examples that I provided that there's a different kind of lens in terms of the collecting focus. Here, they're collecting, the first vial of vaccine, the first person to be vaccinated. They're collecting all of the PPE and the like. And here, the idea is we wanted objects that would tell the full story. In other words, they are already anticipating, as was the case with 9/11, the New York Historical Society and Kenneth Jackson, they said, we're indiscriminate. We don't know what's going to be important later. We're going to collect everything, including the dust that was created by the planes crashing into the World Trade Towers. Now, what's very interesting, and this is where this issue of shame, because I do think that we are very preoccupied with pride and with positive feelings when we talk about heritage, and the sort of positive value of positive feelings. But in fact, there is a positive value to shame. And I think that the role of shame, and whether it's in relation to a genocide, such as the Holocaust, or in relation to the catastrophic failure, human failure to deal with this pandemic, bad in the U.S., even worse in Brazil, unbelievable. It's simply unbelievable. And so here in this Washington Post article, how future generations will judge humanity's performance against the coronavirus, what's fascinating is it begins actually with a description of the collecting of this material. that that there is now 30 million documents from 9,000 sites with links to similar troves from Beijing to Paris. Reading like a great international scrapbook, the archive also serves as a warning. These photographs, videos, health documents, website captures, news stories, and social media posts will show future generations what we did wrong in 2020. So this is a legacy of shame. Of course, there are some upsides, but basically and fundamentally, the graduate students of the 22nd century, like some of the archive's researchers today, might be most struck by our colossal failures. And so I do think that legacy is an extremely important one. So I think with that, I'll conclude. And so very much thank you for your attention.
Barbara, thank you. Thank you very much. That was extraordinary. There are so many ideas in there that we need to be taking up in our salons. The chat room is jumping, and I don't see. We've got 11 questions in the Q&A that I don't think we're going to be able to get to. Our plan was to have a bit of an exchange among the panelists here. And Barbara, as you said you would, you did come back full circle and threaded your way back through many of the themes that came up in the earlier talks. I'd like to invite, we do have a set of questions which the, we have a set of questions which each speaker submitted a question, and so we have those there for people to think about. However, since these questions were formulated before we all heard the talks, I would like to ask the panelists if there's anybody who'd like to just comment on anything, on any thread, on raise something for discussion that you found quite provocative, stimulating, and like to go forward with us. You can signal. Now look, I have. Okay. If you do have a question, you can reveal your face by turning on your video. Okay. I've just received a text message that. Okay, so we don't have. Oh my gosh, Barbara, that was incredible. Anticipatory heritage. Temporalities, and other speakers did touch on this whole sense of temporalities as well. And this kind of almost pluritemporality that's going on, where we're in the moment and we're recognizing that it's becoming historic. I think what we need to do here is, since we are just about at the end, I'm going to ask Robert Barron to make a quick announcement that he has to make. And go ahead.
Okay, I should be on. Do you see me?
Yeah.
Here I am. Well, you can hear my church bells in the across the street from me. And so it's about time to wrap it up. We have a lot of salon topics. I don't know if we have an opportunity to post them, but we'll be in touch with you in an email to everybody who's been at this event. And it's a running conversation. I know it's a bit frustrating that we haven't been able to talk among ourselves, but I promise it's going to happen. We'll have the salons. It will deal with all these topics we dealt with, or a number of them. We'll, select number. We were thinking of 5 or 6 of them: tourism, sustainability, anti-racism, other environmental and cultural sustainability, heritage programming. We'll be doing some digging and sorting out and winnowing and trying to find out which were the ones which were most popular, most interesting to you. So it's exactly 3 o'clock, but we're keeping the chat open. We'd like to thank everybody for their wonderful patience and their extremely provocative and interesting and important questions. And this is going to continue. And Amy, do you have any final words?
Yes, thank you everyone for coming, and everyone will receive an email. Everyone who attended will receive an email inviting you to consider being part of the salons, and the list of possible salons will be posted at the AFS website. What you're going to do, the salons are on April 9th at 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. We're accommodating in this webinar, we're accommodating our European colleagues, and that's the choice of, explains the choice of time. And so you'll find both the list of salon topics. You sign up for one salon topic, and you can also, you'll also be able to sign up for the time, either 11 or 2. So stay on if you want to post more. We want to give people more opportunities to have a conversation on post. But first of all, let's all thank our speakers. And I know they can't see you, so we just have to send thanks to our participants. Really rich and wonderful event. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody for coming.